Hey there, everyone, and welcome to the 9th day of Squatchmas. Now, tonight's story, well, it's a bit more of a slow burner. There's a lot more of a setup before we get to Bigfoot, but it's all worth it. So, you might want to put a few extra snacks on the plate before you sit down by the tree. Are you ready? Yeah, I know you are. Me too. Let's do this. This story was told by my great-grandmother and has become family lore. I remember her telling the tale when she was alive, and I was very young. I will tell you that I am from a family of storytellers who never let things like facts get in the way of a really good tale. That being said, they would have been deeply offended if anyone called them liars. They said, there is always truth to their accounts. What the truth is, well, that part they leave up to the listener. As the story is told, my great-grandmother was around 13 or so when it all started. She was number 6 out of 9 children, and she had 5 older brothers and 3 younger sisters. 4 of her older brothers were typical country boys who liked nothing better than being outdoors and getting into whatever trouble young men got into back then. But her brother Clarence was very different. He would rather stay inside with a book than go out raising Cain, as my grandmother would say. But he wasn't just gathering knowledge on things far removed from farm life. He would often come up with ways to do things or solve complex problems by doing something no one had ever thought to do before. So after he had successfully improved the lives of his father and brothers, they stopped giving him a hard time about bookish ways and would often excuse him from many of the more labor-intensive activities. They figured he had earned it, since he had saved them so much time and trouble with his inventions and innovative solutions. Aside from storytelling, my family's other favorite thing to do was cook, or I should say, eat. I can't say they had a passion for cooking, but they had a passion for eating, so learning to be a great cook seemed the natural thing to do. One of the family favorites was, and is, mincemeat pie. Personally, I don't understand the devotion my family has to this dish. I have never liked it, but for everyone else, it was the end-all, be-all of pies. According to the rest of my family, you cannot have a proper Thanksgiving or Christmas without mincemeat pie. The family obsession was cranked up a few notches by my great-uncle Clarence. He particularly was fond of this half-savory, half-sweet pie, and he took it upon himself to make the best mincemeat pie this side of the Atlantic. He went to great lengths to find original recipes from medieval England and used only traditional ingredients, which included wild venison. The thought of a domestic substitute would have been considered sacrosanct. Hunting season was a big-time event in the area, but my family had a large farm to run and seldom had the time to go. As much as the men enjoyed it, well, back in those days, hunting season was for filling your freezer with meat for the winter. And for Clarence and his family, it didn't make any sense to spend days walking around the woods looking for one deer when they had a whole herd of cattle and dozens of chickens, as well as pigs and goats and, well, you name it. They had it all near at hand. But to many, hunting was a necessity. But for them, it was a luxury they didn't have time for. They loved to fish, and that took up what little free time they had for hobbies, so they left wild game to others. The family would just often trade with the neighbor for some venison when he would get his annual deer. He would give Clarence all he needed for pies, and then with the help of my great-grandmother and a couple of their other sisters, they would make several pies and give 2 to the neighbor for supplying the meat. This suited the neighbor just fine, and it worked out well, until the year the neighbor had a stroke and he couldn't go hunting anymore. One day, the old man gifted Clarence his old hunting rifle, and he suggested that Clarence try hunting for himself. Being a country boy, Clarence knew how to handle a gun and all the basics of hunting. He had even gone out with some of his friends once, long time ago. He didn't have any qualms about shooting a deer, Farm life teaches kids young about the cycle of life. But Clarence did not enjoy sitting idle in the woods all day. But he did enjoy mincemeat pies, so he did as the neighbor suggested. So after that, Clarence would spend days on end in the woods during hunting season. But being Clarence, he was very mission-oriented and wanted to get his deer in as short amount of time as possible. So he went down to the Department of Fish and Game. This was well before the internet, so people had to go to the source for their information back then. But he read through all their statistics and looked at all their maps and every other scrap of information they had on the habitat and the habits of the local deer. If Clarence was going to hunt, he wanted to do it efficiently. The first time he went hunting after that, he had shot his deer and was home by noon. Not only had he secured enough meat for plenty of pies, but he stocked his neighbor's freezer with venison for the winter as well. This gained him praise from his father and older brothers, who were generally kind to him, but often struggled to connect, since he was so different from all of them. But this gave them something they could brag about to everyone, how Clarence always shot a deer when he went out hunting. They were very proud of him. My great-grandmother said that Clarence was pleased that his father and brothers were so pleased, but he never liked hunting. It was just a means to an end, but he was good at it. Clarence kept up his close relationship with the neighbor, helping out around the place and always bringing him pies and filling his freezer for the winter, right up until the man had to be moved into a nursing home a few years later. After that, Clarence would often give most of the deer meat to someone around the town that was struggling. His own family had plenty to eat, and he knew that so many families didn't, so he would keep just enough for the family's traditional holiday pies, and the remainder would be divided up to feed as many as possible. Clarence's annual search for deer meat became the town's unofficial early start of the holiday season. By opening day of deer hunting, there would be bets on how quickly Clarence would be back with a deer. Most bets were placed favoring him returning by noontime, and more often than not, the winner would collect their winnings before they sat down for lunch, right up until the year of 1948. It had been an exceptionally cold fall, and there already had been a snow flurry before deer season started. But Clarence just checked his books and maps and then started out on opening day before sunrise. By now, those who were not out hunting would often gather at the local coffee shop that was across the street from the deer weight station, waiting for Clarence to roll up in his old pickup truck with that year's deer in the back. By the time 5 p.m. came and went, the townspeople had decided that even Clarence could have a bad day of hunting, and they went home. But a few of them started to wonder, and they thought they ought to go out and check. So they headed over to the farm to see if everything was all right. But by now it was getting dark, and Clarence's brothers had been deciding if they should start out to go look for him. The men from town offered to help, and they were all in the barn saddling the horses when Clarence came walking out of the woods, dragging a deer carcass. At first, everyone sighed with relief and figured they had just overreacted. But as he got closer, they could see there was blood on his face from a large gash on his forehead, and he was limping. Clarence thanked everyone for their concern and said he was fine. He had slipped and fallen, and there was nothing to worry about. The men went home, but a few days later, Clarence delivered packages of beef instead of venison like usual. No one complained. A nice package of grass-fed beef was far more valuable than venison, and it was very welcome to a family with a lot of mouths to feed. It was generous, but it didn't make any sense. People were grateful, but it sure seemed strange. Clarence had shot a deer. There had been plenty of witnesses who saw him dragging one out of the woods. People started to talk. After that, Clarence and his family delivered baskets of meat from the farm, as well as preserves and things they had canned from their garden. It was a godsend to those who were in need of a little help. The kindness of Clarence and his family ensured The gossip was kept to a minimum, but people did wonder why he never included venison in the packages again. He still went hunting every year. If anything, he seemed more dedicated to the pursuit than ever, and was often the first one to return to the weight station on opening day. Only the family knew the real reason. That day that Clarence came home late, he had not just fallen and bumped his head, or rather he had, but it was far more serious than a simple slip. That day he had not gone to his usual spot. He figured the snow and how unseasonably cold it was would have changed the deer's usual patterns. So instead of going up the mountain, he went deeper into the valley on the other side. His foresight paid off, and he soon found a game trail and was following it when he came across a narrow gorge. He could see where the game trail skirted the edge of the deep ravine when he caught movement far off in the trees. He was looking out over the gorge and then down the slope a ways inside the trees. He could see something there. He couldn't see what it was, but he could see that it was black and very large. Clarence thought he might be looking at a bear. He had never seen a bear around there, but he didn't know what else it could be. It was too large to be a deer, and it was standing up on its back legs, so he thought. Clarence didn't have a chance to see what it was, because just then a huge buck stepped out of the woods on the far side of the gorge. The ravine was deep but narrow, and only about 30 yards separated them. The buck caught sight of Clarence and snorted, but it didn't run. It pawed the ground with agitation. Clarence said later that it was standing there broadside to him, and there might as well have been a target painted on its chest, so he took the shot. He said he wasn't looking forward to hiking all the way around the rim of the ravine to retrieve his prize, but he wasn't going to let that stop him from bagging a 10-point buck. Everyone knew that Clarence wasn't in it for the trophies, but a buck that large would feed a lot of people. Clarence was an excellent marksman. He never pulled the trigger unless he was absolutely sure he had a clean shot. The deer went down immediately. But unfortunately, so did Clarence. He hadn't factored in the fact that he was standing on a sheet of ice, and the kick from the rifle knocked him off balance, and he felt himself falling. He said the next thing he knew, he was lying on a large boulder about 20 feet below where he had been standing. He was stiff and cold, and he didn't know how long he had been out. At first, he thought he was fortunate because if he had not landed on the boulder, he surely would have fallen to his death. But then he started to become worried. He found there was no way to climb back to the top. There was nothing but sheer rock, and any hand or footholds that might have been there were now slippery with ice. Climbing down wasn't an option either. Even if he could manage to climb down the massive boulder without falling another 30 feet, he would then be trapped in the ravine. Clarence figured the best bet was to wait for help. But then he quickly realized he was so far from his usual hunting areas that no one was likely to find him, at least not for a while. He was trying to figure out if he had anything that he could burn. He didn't have wood to make a proper fire to get warm, but he thought maybe he could make enough smoke that someone would notice. But before he could come up with a plan, he heard footsteps coming from above. Clarence was so relieved at first. They must have been able to track his footprints, and they found him straight away. And then he realized that it was still too soon for anyone to have started to worry. The sun was still well above the horizon, and even if his family had started to wonder, they certainly weren't going to realize something was wrong. Not yet, anyway. Clarence thought it was good fortune that another hunter had just happened to come along. Excitedly, he started to call out, "I'm down here. I need a little help." But no one answered. Clarence said he could still hear someone up there walking around, and he could hear heavy breathing, like a large man who had just run a mile. Clarence called out again. "I fell, and I'm now trapped. Could I get a little help?" There was again no reply, but this time he saw a face peek out from over the edge. At first he thought the man had a scarf wrapped around his face, but as he watched it, it sunk in that the man's features weren't quite right. There was a pronounced brow ridge, and his mouth was too wide, and his jaw was pushed too far forward. He said it wasn't like a gorilla or a bear. It didn't have a snout, and its jawline jutted forward more than a human's, and the forehead sloped back, making his head look a little pointy. It dawned on Clarence that the man was not wearing a scarf. It was actually hair all over the man's face, except for the nose and around the eyes, and by this point he wasn't pretty sure that he was looking at a man at all. He also noted that its eyes seemed to be all black, but he didn't get a good look because he said he must have passed out again. Next thing Clarence knew, he felt a large hand grabbing him under his arms, and he was being lifted. The creature slung him over its shoulder like he was a sack of potatoes. It was then that Clarence realized this thing was not wearing clothes, but was covered in hair all over its body. Clarence said between how badly it smelled and the pain from his injuries, he began to feel a little woozy. It hurt so much he must have blacked out again, because when he came to, he was lying on the ground at the top of the ravine. Clarence noted that he would have just chalked the whole thing up to hallucinations. He was a man of science and could not deny that a head injury might cause a man to temporarily lose his sense, except for the fact the deer that he had shot was lying next to him. But he had seen the deer fall. It was dead before Clarence went into the ravine. Someone or something had to have put it there. At that time, the word Bigfoot wasn't on the radar yet, but locals did occasionally tell stories of the hairy, wild man. Clarence didn't know what to make of all the old stories, and in the end, he figured that he knew what had happened to him, and he knew what he saw, and he also knew that he likely would have died in that ravine if someone or something hadn't helped him out of it. Not only did it save his life, but it brought him the buck as well. So after dressing the carcass and speaking with his father, Clarence took what remained of the deer and he left it at the top of the ravine. He also left one of the mincemeat pies that he had made. My grandmother said she was a little annoyed at first. Those pies were a special family tradition, and she felt like the majority of the deer meat was payment enough, and a pie would be wasted on a wild beast. But Clarence pointed out that if it wasn't for that wild beast, there would be no pies at all that year, nor would he be around to provide the ingredients for any more pies in years to come. Great-grandmother said that got to her. She realized how petty she was being, and it sunk in that she might have really lost her big brother. She quickly changed her mind about the subject, and after that she became Clarence's #1 helper. Since the deer was given to Clarence's rescuer, their father had agreed to slaughter one of his beef steers, as the thought of people going hungry because there was no extra venison this year was just too much to bear. It was no small thing to butcher one of the herd, as the family was quite comfortable, and they felt strongly about giving back to their community. Clarence's habit of giving out the meat that he didn't need to those who were in need had turned into a full-blown family tradition of handing out food baskets to anyone struggling during the holidays. It's a tradition we carry on to this day, although we no longer grow all the food ourselves. Every year after that, Clarence would take his deer carcass to the top of the ridge and leave it with a mincemeat pie. He said he never saw the wild man again, but he would often hear footsteps a few yards off the trail pacing him. He said he wasn't the least bit afraid. He was curious, but never tried to force things, and he just went about his business like it wasn't there. Said he always felt safer in the woods, knowing that he was out there. One year he had been having a particularly hard time locating any deer. He hadn't seen any signs, and it was already past noon. Clarence had not heard footsteps, but he had been hearing strange bird calls occasionally, and then he would see a flash of movement that he couldn't place. He had been trying to see deeper into the trees when he heard that strange bird call right behind him. Clarence spun around, and there stood a large doe not 20 yards away. Clarence said it was the darndest thing. She just stood there in the middle of the trail, seemingly dazed. After that year, Clarence took to calling whatever was out there his hunting buddy. Clarence continued to go out hunting every year right into his 70s. But after several fights with his doctor, his wife, and his kids, Clarence finally conceded that hiking all over the mountain by himself all day probably wasn't a good idea anymore. My grandmother said, as glad as she was that he had given up hunting, it still broke her heart to see how sad he looked when opening day of deer season came, and for the first time in 50 years, Clarence wasn't going out into the woods. One of his sons had volunteered to take up the tradition, but Clarence said no. He knew his son would hate it. And by then, there was so much goodwill amongst the locals that Clarence had plenty of offers of venison. So for the first time in half a century, Clarence did not go out to hunt on opening day of deer season. He had been sitting on his front porch drinking a cup of coffee after dinner when he noticed that there was something lying on the ground in front of the barn. At first he thought it was one of the dogs. He thought it was a strange place for it to take a nap, and then when he saw no movement, he grew concerned that it was perhaps injured. He went over to it, and then he saw that it was not a dog at all, and it was, in fact, a deer carcass. Clarence knew there were plenty of people happy to share their deer meat, but who would have just dumped a carcass on the ground without saying anything? Everyone knew that he didn't need a whole deer, and didn't they want the lion's share of their own kill? The whole thing was very odd. Even stranger was the fact that the deer had not been shot. It clearly had died from a broken neck, because it had no other wounds on it whatsoever. Clarence started to suspect something was off at that point, but he decided to look around for any other signs. The barnyard was dry and hard-packed, but out behind the barn, where the soft piles of manure were tossed, there were large, barefoot, human-looking footprints leading into the woods. Clarence and his son dressed the deer and took what they needed for their holiday pies, and then they hung the rest of the carcass just inside the wood line. They set a large mincemeat pie next to it on a stump. The next day, the carcass was gone, and so was the pie, but the plate was sitting back on the stump without a single crumb left on it. Every year after, just around the first day of hunting season, a deer carcass would show up in Clarence's front yard, and Clarence would set up a couple pies outside on that same tree stump every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year. Clarence said that he figured it would be rude to give the deer carcass back after he had taken what he needed. So instead, he left out more pies, since he was pretty sure that was what the wild man wanted from the bargain. We would end up using the rest of the venison to make holiday pies for the bakery in town, and of course many were given away as well. Clarence's pie became a bit of a local attraction, with people coming from miles away to visit the bakery that sold his pies. Things went on like that for about another 20 years, until Clarence passed away in his sleep at the age of 97. It seemed like anyone Clarence had ever met turned up for his funeral. People wanted to pay their respects and to tell the story about how Clarence and his kindness had touched their lives. The first day of deer season after Clarence passed, the family watched all day, but no deer carcass arrived. They were given venison by friends that year. By then, there were plenty of locals happy to donate part of their deer meat for such a good cause. But it wasn't the same. And the demand for the mincemeat pies, well, it wasn't what it used to be anyway. We still make a few to this day, mostly for the family, but we still get several requests each year for Clarence's pie, as it's known around here. But Aunt Gina's chocolate cream pie and Cousin Faye's coconut surprise, spoiler, rum is the surprise, well, they are far more popular these days, which personally I'm fine with. I must admit I am not sorry for the change, but I do wish I could have seen Clarence's hunting buddy for myself. They left a pie outside anyway that year, and the next couple of years after, but it went untouched by anything except birds pecking at it or raccoons feasting and making a mess. We don't know if the wild man was only interested in simply interacting with Clarence, and it was never really about the pies in the first place, or if he simply stopped coming because he assumed the tradition would stop. Or maybe something happened to the wild man the same year as Clarence's passing. If it had been the same one, it would have likely been at least around the same age as Clarence, possibly older. Maybe he wasn't going to return regardless. My family owns the farm, and many of the descendants of Clarence and my great-grandmother and all their brothers and sisters still live in the same town. And I have countless cousins, and we all get together every Christmas, and we put together food baskets for the community. Clarence died before I was born, but when I was little, we would go to the farm to help put together the holiday food baskets. Our mothers and our aunts would instill in us how important it was to give back to the community and to be grateful for what we have when others have so little. And my great-grandmother would always tell my cousins and I the story of our great-uncle Clarence and his hunting buddy. She would say that showing kindness to people in need, well, it just might change your life in ways you never imagined. All right, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. You know, the writer didn't give a name that I could use, so we're going to stay with just anonymous. So tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really didn't know that mincemeat pies had meat in them. Well, some do anyway. The only ones I'd ever had been filled with nuts, fruits, and spices, more like a dessert. But looking into it, I found out that mincemeat pies, well, they do. They go way back to medieval times, and it was popular in the Tudor era to have fillings that were 50% meat. Well, it turns out that different regions here in the U.S. and all around the world, well, they have different types of mincemeat pie fillings that's traditional to them and their region. So, if what she was talking about doesn't sound like your mincemeat pie, that's okay. They're allowed to be different. All right, everyone. Well, listen, that's it for the 9th day of Squatchmas. If you see a mincemeat pie while you're out or on a menu, go ahead and give it a try. You might like it. I did like tonight's story. It was a nice slow burn. I loved it. I hope you did too. And until tomorrow, which you know we're going to be meeting up again, I need you to always remember, absence of proof is not proof of absence. Thanks for listening.